Welcome to the living room where we listen, learn, and live together. I'm your host, Richard Martin, and I thank you for joining us one more time. We've been inspired and transformed over the past several weeks, and I want to thank you for your listenership and your followership and your support. Today, I have another friend of mine in the living room. Her name is Dr. Samantha O'Bannon. Dr. Sam is a doctor of clinical psychology, graduating from Oakwood University and Loma Linda University, and she's currently a neuropsychology fellow. She is also the author of Essentially Me coloring books, which I am so excited to talk about with her, and she hails from the island of Bermuda, which you know is near and dear to my heart. There it is, Bermuda flag in the house. You can't see it, but I have my Bermuda flag pillow right on my couch, not far from me.
Yes.
Welcome to the living room, Dr. Sam. We're glad to have you.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I really appreciate the time, as always.
Not a problem at all. So let's just start from the beginning. What led you or inspired you to pursue a career in clinical psychology?
That's a loaded question. It really is. But I guess like the short response is, I think like many people, I started off pre-med. You know, I was really interested in the sciences and the mind and everything else. When I got to Oakwood, biology, nothing about that major made me happy. And the only part I realized that I really, really enjoyed was the brain, right? So in one of my classes, because initially I did a lot of like random minors, just trying to figure out what I wanted my life to look like.
Sure.
And at one point, one of my minors was psychology. And we had this seminar class where Dr. Cook actually made us like research a bunch of different careers in psychology. And I found neuro. And I never knew it existed. I literally fell in love with it. And like since then, I've been like actively pursuing it. I love being able to like help people and being able to like figure out like puzzles, if you will. You know, like I feel like the mind is like this massive enigma. Like it's beautiful and it's amazing. And there's so much we don't know about it yet. So I just really like being able to do a little bit of both, not only like the therapy side, if I'm interested in that, and being able to like help people like work through just life in general, because life is rough. But then also having that extra knowledge of like the brain and how things work and how things, if you have any type of difficulties, will manifest in your life. So that's like the short story.
And I'm sure there are a lot of nuances that we could dive into that
Yes.
would create the long story. So what exactly is neuropsychology?
So it's this beautiful love child between brain and behavior relationships. So there's lots of different things, I guess, that a neuropsychologist can do. There's lots of different functions that they can take. But the main thing is just in our profession, again, not only do we have the knowledge of like behavior and how behavior plays out in our lives and how it can affect us, but then how those specific points of behavior tie to our brains. So we have a deeper understanding of how the brain works, how it functions, like what basically it's like neurology and psychology combined, to then be able to not only diagnose whether it's like medical or psychological conditions, but then to be able to apply that into everyday life and then help people figure out like, how do I, now that I know this about my brain, like what do I do? How do I use this? Or how can I improve it? So
Have you seen an actual brain from that for research purposes so that you have a better understanding of what it is you're studying? And if you have, what about the brain have you learned that maybe surprised you the most that you didn't know prior to pursuing this career?
Okay, first I have seen an actual brain, and it was one of the best days ever. Actually, I've seen several brains.
Really?
Yeah, and it's been really, really fascinating. So one, like really briefly, I've seen brains in like labs before. So for example, like we know diseases such as like Alzheimer's, for example. The only way to truly diagnose Alzheimer's is post-mortem. Wow. So They, a lot of times, you know, especially if it's like a research facility, they will have people who commit their brains to research, especially a lot of like NFL athletes and everything else, that will dedicate their brains so that we can learn more about it. So I've seen brains in that setting, like done like brain cutting and slicing, and it's just been fantastic. But the other part is one of the really, really cool things, and this is really, if I'm being honest, what like super sold me on neuropsychology. In a medical setting, neuropsychologists have the ability to do what's called like a WADA test, which was the most fascinating thing I've ever seen in my life. And I was like, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I don't care how long it takes. Long story short, if we're trying to localize like a lesion in the brain, or let's say there's like seizure activity until we really don't know how it's affecting or whatever the case is, we have the ability to go in with like a neurologist or like a neuroradiologist or something else, or another team member, I guess, can't think of the word I want to use, but we thread like a catheter through the femoral artery, through the leg, all the way up to the brain, and we take turns. The person is awake. It's fascinating. You have to look this thing up. We take turns putting each side of the brain to sleep, and while one side of the brain is sleeping, we're doing testing. So it's given us so much information on like language mapping, you know, which side is considered more dominant for that individual, like what abilities they actually do have. It gives so much information, but like that type of stuff is super fascinating. And they also do sometimes, you know, they'll actually operate, and if they have to go in for like a brain surgery of some sort, I've actually been present during one of those where they like literally like take off part of the skull and they're testing the brain as the person is like responding. So just sitting there like watching them put electrodes in different parts of their brain, I'm just like, it was like a geek moment.
Is the brain a muscle? And the second part of that is whether or not it's a muscle. I've heard this language of left brain, right brain. Is that a myth, or is there actually a left brain, right brain? If so, what do they mean? How do they function? And is it possible for a person who might identify as, you know, the person says, I'm more left brain, I'm more right brain. Can we learn to effectively use both sides of our brain?
You have some really tough questions. You're making me go back to like, all my neuroanatomy. Okay, so starting from the beginning, like the brain is definitely this massive organ, right? The term, when we say it's like a muscle, it's because we can effectively change the brain. It is something that you can work on things to like improve or strengthen connections. Thus the whole like it's a muscle, because you can actually like strengthen it in certain areas if you're like really on it. Left brain, right brain is absolutely a thing. All that's referring to though is just there are different brain structures that are responsible for different things, right? Okay. So generally speaking, not going into like all of the neuroanatomy, and to be honest, there's so much that I still don't even know, but like the general idea of that is that we tend to see that for most people, left brain is dominant for language, right brain is dominant for more like visual spatial or nonverbal abilities and skills, right? So that's where a lot of people are like, oh, like I'm more left brain because I'm more analytical, or I'm more verbal, or I think in terms of words, or whatever the case is. And then creatives are like, oh no, I'm super right brain, you know, everything is just laid back. And I'm being facetious, but sure. Yeah, so it's definitely a thing, like, yeah. And there's so many, like, the questions that you're asking are so complex, and there's so many layers to it. They can each have like an hour conversation in and of themselves, right? But it's speaking mostly to dominance. We use a lot of our brains regardless of which hemisphere is dominant for us. So for most of us, we're using different portions of our brain all the time. Actually, I would say most, only because some people have like, you know, hemispherotomies, or like some of their brain's been removed and they can't use it. But like most people, they're using both sides of their brain for different things. It's just which connections are stronger, because our brains are very smart, pun intended, and they're very efficient, right? And their desire is for efficiency. So the brain is not going to sit there and be like, oh, well, let me go all the way around this route to try to figure out how to get there. Like, no, it's going to go based off the fastest connection that it can find to get to whatever information you need to retrieve.
And by repetition, repeated activity, iterations of a certain activity, it creates pathways. So when we wake up in the morning or before we go to sleep at night, we don't think hard and long about whether or not to brush our teeth. We have years of training of just doing that. And our brains just naturally open up that pathway. Hopefully, right. We're hoping. If not, we highly encourage that. So let me ask you this. Another example of that, though, comes to mind when you think about driving. If you've ever been on a long distance road trip, there's a time where you'll say, man, I kind of spaced out a little bit. I didn't fall asleep, but I was just micing off, thinking about whatever, singing the songs on the radio. And I wasn't necessarily paying attention to every road sign or every car that was passing me. But my brain was taking snapshots of those things, but it just wasn't focusing on everything. There was a lot going on, and I cued in on one thing or another. Another question that I have for you is, when you talk about the hemispheres of the brain and language acquisition, skill implementation, I think about children. A friend of ours recently sent us a video, and their 1-year-old daughter is beginning to walk. And that's an exciting time. Not long ago, my niece, we received a video, and she was beginning to talk and saying more words. So for children, is there a particular hemisphere that is being targeted more than another, or are children taking in all kinds of stimulation and both sides are being developed at the same time?
There's no concrete answer for that. It really just depends on the environment. It depends on the information that they're being exposed to. And I think everyone basically goes in, I mean, they may not know, but your brain develops a preference for whatever's easier for you, right? Wow. We see that in a lot of kids, how they show dominance is like, if you have those kids that are super verbal, you know, they're just talking way more than they should. They have many more words than they probably should. They're advanced verbally. That, in addition to many other markers, give us indication that their brain has selected a dominance. Like, if you think about it in, I don't want to use the word like evolutionary because I don't want to imply like, you know, actual like evolution versus creativity, but from an evolutionary perspective, right? Our goal is survival. Our goal is to get our needs met, right? Sure. So if a child learns, if I use this language, my caregivers are more likely to respond, then that's going to strengthen that connection because it's telling their brain like, oh, this is how I get my needs met, right? For some kids, language may not be that strong, or maybe they have some sort of difficulty. Maybe there's something neurological going on. There's a myriad of possible explanations, but some kids we're finding they're not that verbal, or maybe they find that by complaining or crying or tantruming, they're more likely to get the attention that they desire. And what most people don't realize is that attention is attention is attention. You know, from a child, like, yes, you would think like, oh, but it's negative attention. I'm yelling at them. Like, either way, if they're looking for attention and they're getting it, more so if they're tantruming, then they're going to continue that behavior. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to say that, like, as children, there are certain hemispheres that are preferred. It's also hard to guess the rate at which certain hemispheres are being developed because it depends on so many different factors.
Right. And I appreciate you balancing out that thought that it's hard to kind of nail it down in terms of rate, but preference, we can definitely see markers of that. And I think the same can be said as we grow. In your research and in your studies and in your encounters thus far, would you say that there is a connection between our brain's functionality and A, habit development, and B, habit deconstruction or breaking a habit? Can our brains be rewired to develop habits and break habits?
The immediate answer is yes. Our brains can absolutely be rewired. We can absolutely form new habits. There's that saying, like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. First of all, that's false, because you can always teach an old dog new tricks. Mm-hmm. But I think the same functions for us, you know, like the brain has this wonderful and unique ability to reorganize itself. It's very like well crafted, you know, it's phenomenal. Like I think about it all the time. I'm like, wow, God, like you really outdid yourself on this one, you know?
Right.
But you can absolutely do that. I think bringing it back to your beginning question in terms of whether or not you have an ability to kind of like, I guess, form habits or move away from bad habits. Again, yes, that has a lot to do with your neurological makeup and your actual brain, but it also plays a lot, like environment. Environment plays a lot into all of this. There are critical periods. That's like a term that's used in like the field, not just neuropsychology, but like child health in general. But there are certain critical periods that children have, right? Especially in that like 0 to 3 stage. And then there's like critical periods outside of that, depending on what exactly you're talking about. But the brain is absorbing so much information and is learning so much information at a young age. It's actually quite remarkable. And again, what a lot of people don't realize is how perceptive children are and how much they're actually picking up. We learn a lot from our environments and we pick up on those skills. A lot of times we learn our coping skills or our habits from our environments, right? But I've seen a lot of parents, whether in therapy, in a clinical setting, or even just like people in general, people that I'm familiar with or our peers or whatever, that just have this perception of like, well, they're kids, they can barely even talk, they have no idea what I'm talking about. Like, that's actually not true. Like, their brains are like little camera machines and everything is being stored, all of that information, even if they can't remember it to be able to give you back those details, like it's been stored. It's like a file vault, right? And so a lot of times that leads into like, there's a whole bunch of literature that leads into coping, that leads into it even plays a huge part in like in the educational system and their ability to access certain things. There's a whole line of research on trauma and how being exposed to certain traumas, not being exposed to appropriate coping strategies. And I say this on like literally everywhere that I say, because I'm so passionate about this research. Like your long-term exposure to trauma can actually lead to like a 30-point decline in your IQ.
Wow.
And just so that you know, 30 points is highly significant. We consider standard deviations when we're referring to like intelligence and cognitive abilities, and a standard deviation is 15 points. So 30 points is literally, it can make the difference between like a high average score and like a low average or below score. Like that is immensely large in terms of how much discrepancy and variability that something as simple as trauma could have an effect on, right? And that doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to be smart. That doesn't mean that you're not smart. It's just our brains are very flexible. We have a term neuroplasticity, so they're very plastic, they're malleable, you can mold them, and everything goes into that. Everything.
You have a passion for pediatric neuropsychology. Why the children for you?
Because they're cute.
Most of the time.
Well, yeah, most of the time, because some of, but no, honestly, again, literally every question that you're asking is such a deep question because it has so many layers to every single response. But I am really passionate about being able to advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves. And I am really, really impacted by children, especially because a lot of times it's not their fault, you know, like a lot of times they're in situations that they can't personally control. And unfortunately, they are reaping the consequences of those actions. Case in point, I saw a video the other day, and I try to guard myself against a lot of the videos that are coming out and surfacing on social media, especially about all like the police brutality. I personally, I can't handle it. But one of them snuck through, and I saw a video maybe a day or two ago of a police brutality situation happening in Atlanta, where 2 police were like on top of this man, like literally punching him, saying that like he bit them. But like the child, oh my gosh, I started crying. The child was screaming, running around them, like, Daddy, Daddy. And I was just in tears because I'm like, wow, they've just ruined this child's life. They've ruined his life. Yes, he can recover. Yes, he can develop coping skills. Yes, you can definitely overcome some of the trauma. We know that. But we have no idea the amount of damage that has just occurred by the mere fact that they were doing this in front of this child. The fact that the child was there and none of the adults had the wherewithal to be like, get in the car and or close your eyes and or don't watch or listen to this. That like really, really breaks my heart. It's a huge point of, it's a soft spot for me and a huge point of contention simultaneously. And a lot of my research in my doctorate program was surrounded on trauma, specifically non-accidental trauma or child abuse, and the effects of that. So I just feel like there's so much to know, and it's such a unique time and such a critical time that we still don't know all that we need to know. But even with the information that we have, sometimes it's frustrating because we have all of this information from the literature, we have all of this information from the research, but sometimes it's not translated into our actual society, into our parenting. Like I feel like there should be parenting classes as soon as you find out that you're pregnant, so that you can learn some of this stuff.
I found that there are more extensive classes on how to handle new televisions and computers than there are on parenting. I'm a pastor, and we are not trained in a special way in terms of interacting with children, such as pediatric neuropsychologists, pediatric nurses, pediatric doctors, But a large part of what I do, as you know, covers every age range. We bless babies. We're there to receive and congratulate new parents, and all the way to the other end, where we preside over funerals and major life events in between. In my pastoral career so far, I have had a greater sensitivity to the vulnerability of children. You just observe the dynamics in certain families and the parent-child relationships, how the child responds verbally, and this is what moves me the most, non-verbally. You wonder, is this child afraid of their parents? And in certain communities where we come from, sometimes that's like a badge of parental honor. You better be afraid of me.
You better be afraid of me.
You know what I mean? And I don't think we often process just how much those lines can be blurred between, a healthy respect level for a parent versus, okay, now there are some deep underlying things that are taking place. And I heard this mentioned recently, that a lot of people are spending their adulthood trying to process their childhood.
Ooh, you're going to take me in a whole different direction.
Let's go there, Sam.
Because I have been, you have no idea, this whole COVID, quarantine, everything, I have definitely been on a soapbox talking about how this is a massive community-based trauma, and we don't realize that. Like, we're all in the midst of this, and just that combined with, like, especially in our cultures, like, so many of us are fighting these generational curses that we have previously not identified as a generational curse. Many of our parents have yet to identify that these same things are generational curses. Like, this is spiritual warfare at a whole different level. And it really blows my mind. It does. But you're so right. Like, most of what we're doing in adulthood is going back to process their trauma from the past. And the unfortunate part is, I will say this, I don't think that most of it is intentional. I think our parents and our parents' parents, like everyone, we're only doing the best that we can. Sometimes it is, but I'm just trying to give credit where credit is due. Like, we're doing the best we can. We're doing all that we know, right? But again, what we know is based on modeling. What's familiar to us and what seems right to us is based on what's been passed down to us, whether or not that's something that's positive or negative. Like in a lot of Caribbean cultures, won't go into detail, but you have the whole notion of like, oh yeah, like when a baby's crying and they're super upset, what do? Rub a little something on the pacifier, knock them out. To everybody else, that's like, that's child abuse. Are you insane?
Right.
Like in a lot of our cultures of people of color, like spare the rod, spoil the child. You're gonna get beat. And in general society these days, you're going to jail unless it's with an open hand. Hint, hint. Yeah. And or there are no bruises. Right? But then a lot of Caribbean families or West Indian families or people from the islands, like, you get beat with anything.
Right.
A shoe, a hanger, whatever can be grabbed in that moment is what's going to happen. But again, perspective, right? It's based on modeling. It's based on what's familiar and what's culturally appropriate. So I just, again, to be fair, I think we're only doing the best that we can. And unfortunately, many of our peers, those who are older and those who are younger or even the same age, are now starting to have these conversations, and parents are offended.
Right.
Parents are like, they're highly offended because they're like, don't, like, I know so many parents right now that are just in a very bad place because they feel like they're being personally attacked, or they feel like they did their best. And so how dare you now come back in your adulthood, when you've made it to adulthood, you're welcome, to now try to tell me that I traumatized you by something that I didn't do. Like, that's just your perception. And I mean, sometimes, like, it's going to take a real harsh conversation, but sometimes it is what it is. Like, I think everybody's trauma is like an individualistic experience. You can't dictate whether or not somebody's experienced trauma based on what you felt about the situation.
I remember being very defensive in a class I took in seminary, marriage, family, and interpersonal skills. And our professor made a statement, and I think he intentionally made it in a way that was at first very broad. And I wasn't the only one whose defense walls and mechanisms were quickly enacted. And he said, every family is broken. And hands went up. You know, people were saying, how could you say that? Because I think we all had a very myopic understanding of brokenness. There was a stereotypical image in our minds of a certain type of community, a certain family structure, certain behaviors that would have been present. And so he let us kind of rant and rage or whatever for a few minutes, and then he came back and substantiated what he said. He began to expose us to different types of family systems, and that word survival came up, that families, just like individuals, are seeking to survive. We're seeking to maintain a sense of equilibrium in the home. Some families do it by yelling at the top of their lungs over top of one another, and they don't consider that to be yelling. They're just talking. But another family is very silent and secretive or selective with what they talk about, where, you know, what happens in our house stays in our house. And so we adopt these things. And you're right, it's not until we have the chance to grow, mature, reflect, critique what our experience has been, that we say, that might have been the best we could do, or that might have just been what we did, whether or not it was the best we could do. But it doesn't mean that we can't explore it. So there's a resource that I've read, and it's called post-traumatic slave disorder, or post-traumatic slave syndrome. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, Dr. Joy DeGruy. And her theory is that, particularly in the African-American community, or really, that's what she focuses on in her book, but I think the principles apply to any oppressed group of people who had to have adaptive behavior in order to survive. So the example that she gives is, you know, the mother basically depreciating her daughter so as to spare her from the unwanted attention of the slave owner or the overseer. And that was kind of creative for the time. But we're not in those times anymore, but we still have vestiges of those practices where some parents have only caught demeaning statements from their parents, and all they know how to do is say the same thing. So the child says, I want to go to college. And the parents just say, you ain't going to college. You're just like so-and-so. No one's ever been to college. All you're going to do is this. And I think the word that, the environment. So how do we break out of that? How does one seek to merge and forge a different path? And I sense that we're kind of stepping away, and this is good, from just talking about rewiring the brain, because at a certain point, there's a connection between brain and behavior. How does a person say, when I look at my family, my environment, where I've come from, there's some trauma. What's the first step to addressing it? How do we turn the corner?
I mean, I really just think that the first step is most likely just a reflection. Like, you have to be able to sit in that discomfort and reassess, reanalyze, you know, and understand that it's okay. It's okay to be in a space of discomfort or feel as though perhaps this environment wasn't the best. because it could have created these type of scenarios, or it could have led to these, cause and effect and these consequences. But in doing so, it doesn't necessarily take away from the efforts that your parents may have made or the effort that your family may have made, but rather you're just seeking understanding and you're seeking to determine what would be best for you. I think, again, everyone's just trying with what they have, right? And so I think it's a very difficult space to be in. I can say that I've been on a journey of exploration for several years now, and it's rough. It hurts. Yeah. It stings. You get bumps and bruises in between, and there are just certain things that I have realized, and I'm not in any way trying to speak negatively about my family or undermine my family or my parents' efforts. They did a great job. And I'm also looking back and being like, you know what? This is something that my family has chosen to do. And now that I'm older and I'm seeing the effects that it had on me versus the effect that it had on my sister, like, I have a comparison point, right? Because again, no two people are going to respond to the same situation the same either, which makes it really hard, because then you have parents like, but what can we do? Like, there's nothing we can do right. We might as well just try. I mean, yeah, just try with what you have. But I can now look and be like, this is how this statement affected me. This is how this statement affected my sister. Maybe it didn't hit me in a way that it hit her, or maybe vice versa. But like, what would have been a more adaptive response or an adaptive strategy? And with asking myself these questions and going through that level of analysis, I am in a position, like, I don't have kids. It is something that we're talking about, but I'm starting to shape and mold in my mind, like, what would my parenting look like? And how would I want to change things? And what aspects would I want to change in hopes that it stops? It breaks some of these generational curses, and it turns a new leaf. Because what's not going to help is continuing to do the same thing.
You and your husband, we all went to school together. Shout out to Dev. Big Dev. We all went to school together. We all have had intersecting experiences. And right now, our situations in life are quite similar. We've been married for over 5 years. Don't have any children yet, but actively thinking about it, talking about it. And honestly, I would say more now than...
Scared about it?
Say it again? What'd you say?
About it?
Oh, very much so. You know exactly where I was going. Very much more apprehensive. I tell people all the time, I have way more of a respect level for the awesome privilege and responsibility of parenting. That it is not just changing diapers and feeding them baby food.
That's the easy stuff.
Yeah. And as persons of faith, we do come from, Christian context, so we believe God is involved. But I say that to preface my next statement, that it is to some degree rolling the dice. You don't know what you're going to get. This statement helped me to process it, and it was a quote, "The good news and the bad news are one and the same. You are more like your parents than you may want to claim."
Listen.
It blew my mind.
I want to repeat that again.
The good news and the bad news are one and the same. It's not one or the other. It's both. Good and bad news are one and the same. You are more like your parents than you may want to claim. And I felt that not just in reflection, but also in projection, that my children, our children, will receive positives and challenges from me and my wife, from you and your husband. And we aren't even completely cognizant of what all those are about ourselves. So here's where I want to go with it. Somebody asked us recently, you guys are going on 6 years, so what have you learned? And I think people ask you that at every year that you're married, and our answers have evolved and matured. And so here's where I am with it, that if I'm giving encouragement to another young brother who's thinking about marriage, maybe he's in a relationship or considering engagement, my advice to him would be, focus on becoming as whole and complete of a person as you can.
I was just talking about this yesterday.
Take it away. What would your advice be?
Continue. This is profound, please.
Yeah, focus on becoming, I've heard it put this way, you're the best version of yourself, and I like that. My iteration of it is focus on, do whatever you can do to become as whole and as complete as possible. I think sometimes we start with premarital, pre-engagement counseling with the other person, and that's good. I'm an advocate, but I'm almost wondering, and I feel like there needs to be individual pursuits. So what advice would you give if there's a young lady who comes to you today, this afternoon, and says, Dr. Sam, Mrs. O'Bannon, you know, like, we're not old, but people are calling us ma'am and sir. It's weird. They say, excuse me, ma'am, I want to talk to you. What advice would you give concerning marriage? And since we're in that space, where is your head when it comes to the kind of development and growth you want before parenting? So talk about that.
That is heavy and loaded. I literally had this conversation last night. So it's so funny that we're like wavelength right here is this thing. I would say the same. I think that I have a lot of friends who are single, a lot of friends who want relationships or contemplating relationships, contemplating marriage. Everybody's so pressed for marriage. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, y'all, I'm a really candid person, but I'm going to try to say some candid things in a very succinct way.
Okay.
And be politically correct with it. Mm-hmm. I do not think that marriage should be a primary goal in somebody's mind. Mm-hmm. Because I think before that step requires so much development and growth. Yeah. And I think for most of us, because we're also about to hit 6 years on Friday, actually, if most of us were asked and we were completely honest, this is not easy.
It's not.
Marriage is hard. Marriage is painful. Marriage is hurting. Marriage can have many, many great, wonderful things about it as well, right? But I think at the bottom line, my personal perspective of marriage is that it's a relationship that's designed to save you, mm-hmm. which means several things. The first thing, if you're going into a relationship hoping that this other person is going to be that one key that unlocks everything for you or is there to make you happy or whatever, like, you're not in the right place. That's selfish thinking.
It is.
Stop. Pause. You will save yourself so much pain and heartache if you can just pump the brakes on that and work on self. Because your partner in a marriage ends up being your mirror, which is why so many of these relationships don't last.
I don't like looking at myself.
Because literally, if you think about it in the context of cause and effect, right? Everything you put out there to your spouse eventually comes back. If you're getting met with a bunch of negativity and resistance and hostility or whatever, that's most likely because you're putting out something that's rubbing them the wrong way and you're seeing yourself come back through them, right?
Right.
And I can go, it's so much more depth than this, but it's like that person becomes your mirror. And I have seen way too many times, I mean, we did it. I'm just going to be transparent, where we just kind of, not saying like we rushed, but we got into this marital relationship without truly understanding the requirements of a marital relationship and what God's requirements were for that marital relationship. And I don't think that many people are in the position to start truly seeing themselves and truly working on some of those hard things that you may not even recognize because they're deeply embedded until it's too late. And unfortunately, in the society that we live in today, with the generations that exist today, we are in a very, like, I can't think of a term that I want to use, but I'm going to say we're in the midst of like a microwave and popcorn generation. Mm-hmm. We want instant gratification. If it ain't working, next.
Right.
If I'm met with too much resistance or if there's too much drama, I'm over it. Like, there's no true commitment. There isn't. We just like the idea of the commitment. We like the idea of having somebody there. We like the idea of not being lonely. And I think that's such a dangerous place to be in because you have such a potential to not only destroy yourself, but destroy another person in the process. So my advice every time somebody asks a question is like, do you truly know yourself and have you spent enough time working on you? I don't think you need to be perfect. Same as with kids. I mean, I think most of us have this idea or ideal in our mind, like it has to be the right time. Children and marriage are two of those things that I don't think there's ever a right time. Mm-hmm. But there are wrong times.
Definitely.
And so for me, like, I'm in a place where I'm now like, okay, we're about to hit 6 years, and things weren't always great. Things were rough. We had lots of rough patches, but like, we feel stable now. We've made it this far. Like, most likely, if we can make it here, we can keep going, right? But now I'm like, are we ready to now model for children? With what you said earlier, we're like, you're more like your parents than you think, again, not only because of like modeling and generational curses or whatever the case is, your environment, everything else, but like, have I spent enough time working on myself to where I'm not going to pass down my trauma?
That's it.
To an innocent child who doesn't know any better. And that scares me, because I've grown significantly as a person. I can tell you that Devin has grown significantly as a person. And I also know that like, we are constantly in a state of improvement. We'll never get to a place of perfection, but we're striving for it. But that gives me just so much anxiety, because I'm like, you know, genetics are real. And what if we roll the dice and this beautiful blessing decides to be the worst of both of us?
And I don't want to leave you out there alone, and because you are so right. Marriage is work. Marriage is... So my father told me before I got married, and my dad, he often gives very sage advice in very short statements. He said, son, marriage is work.
Genetics.
Marriage is work. Marriage is hard work. Marriage is good work. That's what he said. And I'll never forget it. Like, in my mind, he was just sitting in his recliner and he said, son, marriage is work. Marriage is hard work. Marriage is good work. And I think under each one of those, there's probably more he could have said. And in the 5.5 years that we've been married, I have felt each category in our experience, that this is work. This is hard work. This is good work. I'll add another one. Some of it's fun work. But then there are also not so great feelings too. And for those who would glorify certain aspects of marriage, that both the glory and the gore kind of come together. And on different days, you're trying to figure out which one's outweighing the other, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes in the course of a single day. But I still believe that it's worth it. But like you said, timing, motivation. As I look back, that was another thing my father, both my parents, in fact, asked, why do you want to get married? And now as a pastor, that's probably one of my, quote unquote, I put this in quotes, most profound questions that I raise to couples whenever we're in counseling. And I ask it multiple times. And they're often thrown off. Like, you asked us that in our first session. We're in our 6th session. And I'm saying, that's okay. I'm going to keep asking, why do you want to get married? Because at times, I don't think we come to the point, I don't even know if we are nurtured to be as honest in answering that question. As if we were honest at the heart of hearts. Some of us, I think, try to get into marriage to escape, like you said, the discomfort of loneliness. I think that not a lot. I think to some degree we have a window into comparison. So a well-curated vacation picture of you and Bae on Instagram all of a sudden says, I want that. I want that aspect of marriage. I want the beautiful proposal with all of my friends and family around me. I want the nice wedding. And man, people told us this, and it wasn't until like the next day we realized that they weren't lying. It the engagement, the wedding, it is a single day. It's great, but it is a single day. Marriage is for a lifetime. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, Dr. Sam, that there isn't necessarily a right time, as in 100% guaranteed. I told this to somebody, and I won't occupy too much more time. But I told this to somebody. I said, I got married when I was 26. And they said, okay, what did you think? I said, I could have gotten married at 28 or 30 and been fine. Now, that's not to say I regret getting married to my wife or when we got married. But when you look back on it, you say, it wasn't so determinative. It could have waited, and we could have gotten married 2 or 3 years, So I think that a part of the marital responsibility is to kind of give back some of these lessons to those who are contemplating it, thinking it through.
Yes.
that there's so much that you will only learn afterwards. Now, that being said, you and I have the benefit now of having our own marriages as reference points to help us really think through, do we want to become parents? We know what it was like because
that sleep schedule.
I'm selfish. I can be very
That sleep
selfish.
schedule.
And
That's real though.
I can be selfish with another fully functioning adult. Now we're talking about a blank slate who from go needs you.
Tabula rasa.
Not to
where
be
you have
selfish.
to step up because you are writing on that chalkboard.
And they didn't ask to be here. At least our spouses agreed to be with us.
No, they didn't.
Shout out to Devin and Kyla. We love you guys, man.
Yes, we do.
We really do.
Kyla.
We made a choice, but our children, they didn't ask. They show up. We are what they get. And we have our parents. They are still our parents. There's no point at which that relationship, in the main, even if it's just genetically, ceases to be. Thankfully, we have good relationships and growing relationships. And I just want to circle back to something else you said. You said that the reflection is not easy. It is often painful.
Yes.
That's true.
I mean, let's be real though. Like, who likes being reprimanded? And I'm not saying that that's what it is, but like nobody would intentionally stand in front of a mirror and just keep hearing or seeing the things that they're doing wrong manifest. Like, we don't like that.
Yeah.
Even if you're an open person, like I pride myself on being open to feedback and being able to take criticism. Please tell me if there's anything that I'm doing wrong so that I can learn from it. But that doesn't mean that it's easy.
Yeah.
Especially when you're not, especially if you're hearing it from a person where in your mind has no right, how dare you, when you blank, blank, blank,
sure.
blank, 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 So, I mean, I think everything that you're saying is so critical. It's so important. It's right on par where can it be rewarding? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And there are still so many things about it that I think people overlook. My parents said very short statements too, but I wouldn't say they were as profound as that. But I definitely didn't understand it. Like, I think my mom probably laughed at one point and was like, "Oh, you have no idea how not ready for this you are."
Wow.
And I was like, "Excuse you, attitude. Like, I'm grown, When I say I'm ready. Trust me." And she was like, "Oh, sweetheart, like, you'll see, you'll learn." She's like, "You've got a lot of growing to do." And she's like, "I'm actually excited about this. I can't wait. I can't wait until you get to the point where you have your first, like, whoop moment, like, oh, whoops." Not whoops in terms of I regret it, but whoops in terms of I was wrong. Like, I wasn't prepared for everything.
Right.
My dad's more like, he thinks he's like a comedian. He's kind of funny, very inappropriate at times. So his was more of like a laugh and was like, "Well, I hope you guys aren't getting married for fill in the blank."
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And still, I was equally as offended because I was like, "Ugh, how dare you? Like, stop talking to me about this." But it's just funny. And as we've gone through these years of marriage, it's so funny because I have like these aha moments all the time, these little mini epiphanies where I'll stop and I'll be like, "That's what they were talking about."
Sure.
Oh.
Sure.
All right.
And
well, here we are. Let's learn the lesson.
Yeah. And for the person who's listening, don't be discouraged. In no way are we saying, I think it just requires a level of preparation. And if you are married and listening and in a rough patch, you do develop a sense of grit. You can develop grit in marriage, or you can, find the nearest exit and get out. But I think you miss out. Now, I'm not saying that if relationships are abusive and unsafe, but I'm talking about, if you have run-of-the-mill marriage challenges that if you take the selfish road you can exit, you miss out on a lot of the relationship development and personal development that can come. And speaking to your father's point, again, maybe this is more so just coming from a Christian environment, and it could just be humanity. You know, a lot of us do get married because of those creature cravings. You know, the sex is a part of it. But here's another thing that I guess I could drop on somebody, that sex is binding, but it's not necessarily the glue that keeps two people together. I mean, this is why people who have sex and they break up and go separate ways all the time. That there has to be something more than that creates that ultimate glue. I think, of course, for me, marriage disconnected from a desire to have like God at the center of one's life and of one's marriage, man, it's just bound to be beating your head against the wall.
Rough.
He created this institution, and as mortal, sinful individuals, only he can give us that heart that says, you know what, a part of my responsibility as a husband, as a wife, is to seek the good of the other person. I think you're right that it is a context where salvation, and that part of salvation I mean is that growth to become more like Christ. It is seen in this context. Outside of that, and this might be a very conservative opinion, outside of that, man, I'll just say it. If you are not trying to have a relationship with God, and that is the foundation of your marriage, I would highly advise you rethink marriage. Because sure, people say, well, I know a lot of people who are married who aren't believers, and that's true. I get it. And I'm not saying that, the function of marriage can't work, but for those who this echoes with, you know who I'm talking to, and you know you're being talked to. And my burden is preparation, becoming your whole self. We just got really deep, and I want to take a few steps aside.
Yeah, my little burden, just to say and then wrap up and bring back,
sure.
is I just told somebody this 2 days ago, where I think if you're inclined to, for the people who are in a marriage and who are struggling, because we all know it's a struggle and we don't talk about it enough. Yeah. So a lot of times we feel like we're isolated and alone in that struggle, but usually most of us have gone through a very similar level of struggle. My firm belief is that until you decide to ground yourself and learn whatever lesson that God is trying to teach you, to grow out of whatever God's trying to bring you out of, you are going to continue to run into that lesson, no matter who it is, where it is, why it is, and how it is. So you can leave a marriage and think like, oh, I'm done with this and I'm going into this next situation because anybody else would be better. And I guarantee you there will be a matter of time you're going to hit that same situation again. If not the same details, it'll be the same concept, because you keep running away from the lesson and that growth spot that God is trying to work out of you. So I agree. It's not to discourage. I just think bringing it back to like psychology, mental health, the brain, everything else, the goal is really to just make sure that we're understanding that habits can be changed, habits can be broken, and at the same time, in the reverse of that coin, habits can be created, right? So if you spend your entire life practicing a certain something, like let's say in the context of relationships, if you spent your entire life being unfaithful, I don't know what makes you think that you're going to jump into a marriage and all of a sudden with that one person be faithful. That's not how it works, right? And so it's all about just being cognizant that there's so many different factors that play into our actions, our perceptions, even how we view things. And a lot of it is a myriad of a lot of different factors, including like our genetics, our environment, and everything else. So really just take the time to get to know you, take the time to acknowledge and address the traumas, the good, the bad, the ugly, and just have grace for yourself. Have grace for yourself and realize that like we're all broken. Yeah. We really are. We're all broken. It's just, what are you going to do about it? Listen. And we have the capacity to change it. That's it.
I don't know how it feels in your car, Mr. or Miss Listener, who's listening right now, or who's viewing this on YouTube, but it just got real in the living room. Woo! Yes.
I know, I'm hot too. I'm like, woo!
Yeah, that was good. Topics. So let's widen our lens a little bit, away from the brain. I want to talk about, what kind of strong pivot? I want to talk about hair. Might sound strange. So we go back. We met in 2007. probably 6 at college days, but definitely 2007. So
Yeah.
we're in the teens of knowing one another. That's pretty crazy, right?
Yeah.
And as I was preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about that road trip we all took from Huntsville to Ohio.
I still have those pictures.
Are you serious?
I just saw them the other day.
Good times, man. We were jamming out the music, having a good time. You're a very good driver because I went to sleep like half of that trip. It was phenomenal. So,
Ask about me, guys.
I give all that background to say most of our time together, you've had the long flowing hair, right?
Yes.
And societally, culturally, yeah, there can be this kind of, hair and identity, whether or not a young lady feels that way about herself or whether that is imposed on her. The two are often hand in hand. So you've chosen the short, bald style, I see. And you work in it.
Sun style.
What is it called?
The sun. I tell myself all the time, I should probably stop saying this. I'm like, I look like somebody's son today.
You working it. So why did you?
Thank you.
Why did you choose that? And what are your thoughts on hair? Expectations, perceptions, identity. What led to the choice?
Again, why are all of your questions so heavy? Okay, be brief, Samantha. Be brief. 2 reasons. First reason, primary reason, last year, my sister-in-law, but my sister, was diagnosed with cancer. Mm-hmm. And by the time they caught it, it was stage 4. Mm. And she had to go through like a very rigorous chemo, process and everything else. And I wanted her to feel supported in her process. This ties into the second reason, so now I'll back up. Yes, I have always had very long hair. It was a part of my identity. I was one of those people that anytime a scissor would be close to my hair or close to my area, like anywhere in the vicinity, if I heard a scissor, I was probably shedding tears. Mm. No exaggeration. You guys can ask all my closest friends. I was dramatic with it. Like, I just couldn't. I would cry anytime I had to get a trim because somehow hair was such a major part of my identity. Mm. I felt like if I didn't have this long hair, then it meant I was less than. Wow. And I mean, we know, especially in people of color, we have like our own little spats and disputes back and forth. And so that thing right there was deep in layers, way deep. Sure. It went back into identity issues from childhood. Like my dad is half white, half Caucasian, blonde hair, blue eyes from Kansas, white, like people who were previously raised in a racist household, white. Sure. And so it was always a thing where I had some Caucasian features, like my nose being one of them, and my hair grew really long, and it was softer than even my sister or a lot of my peers. And so it was always something where even from a child, my friends, my peer group, I never felt like I belonged in any one group. Mm. My black friends would say I was too white for them. My white friends would say I was too dark. I highly identified with all my Hispanic friends. I don't know that I actually have any Hispanic individuals in my ethnicity. I probably do, but I can't think of any off the top of my head right now. But I just had a lot of identity issues, but my hair was one thing that was constant and made me feel and it was always something people acknowledged. They were like, oh my gosh, it's so long, it's beautiful, it's this, it's that, blah, blah, blah. So fast forward now, hair was huge. I was always on some sort of hair journey. Every now and then I would get rolled and cut it. And within a week, I spent the next 6 months until it grew back crying about it and complaining to my friends and my family, and they were sick of me. Every single time they're like, can you please stop doing this because we don't want to hear about it. My sister-in-law also had very beautiful hair. It was long. It was just, oh my gosh, it was amazing. She was good with hair at that. And I knew that hair was a part of her identity, similar as it was to me, particularly because with people of color, we get played a lot. Mm-hmm. And everybody just feels like everybody's bald or we can't grow hair or whatever. So as a person of color, when you can grow hair, usually that's a huge thing for you. And everybody else outside of your ethnicity or race, they're like, oh, the touching, is it yours? You know, like it was a whole thing. But I also knew that was important to her. So for me, I was not only in a place in my life where I had a really rough year last year.
Okay.
Like, just being honest, a really rough year. Not only because of her finding out she had cancer and us trying to go through that journey with her, but in my life, I was in a very bad place for a lot of last year and just trying to like make it through, right? Trying to like bring myself through, really try to figure out who I was as a person rather than like everybody else's perceptions of me or identities that I picked up along the way that I didn't even know resonated. I wasn't positive were even resonating with me. And so when she was diagnosed with cancer and she started losing her hair, it broke my heart because I could just see the pain. And I was like, you know what? Like, I don't want you to go through this alone. A group of us actually that all had like really long hair decided to cut our hair and support with her, which she did not want us to do, but it really like moved her. And the other side of that, I just felt like I need to figure out who I am and I need to break these chains that either were created for me or that I've created for myself that don't mean anything. Hair means nothing. But I never believed that. And so when I chose to cut it off, it was so shocking and significant to most of my system. Like, to this day, I think my mom is still probably a little shaken still, and it's been at least a year.
Right.
Where she still makes comments like, this just doesn't seem like you. Like, are you okay? You know, like she's concerned. Because she's like, the Samantha that I knew would never. But I can say that now I am in a place where I don't even care about the perception of other people, about what it means to other people, about how people feel about it, whether they think I look like a man or not. Like, I don't care. Like, I'm just in a place where I'm on a self-love journey. I'm on a journey in my life where I'm truly trying to learn me, grow me, and start all over and heal from traumas that I've had in the past. And this was just one major step in that. And in doing so, I felt so much more free, so much more liberated. And I'm learning to like love myself and appreciate me, not for what certain outward traits I can manifest or what I can show and, oh, look, like hair, but more like, all right, even if I strip it down to where initially I looked in the mirror, I wanted to burst out crying because I was like, wow, I'm ugly. You know, then having to build that back up and be like, no. I mean, it looks kind of crazy. It doesn't always like to listen to you. That's one thing. Like, you know, we're struggling today because today's a day that my hair is not a fan of me. But being able to roll with that.
Sure.
So lots of layers.
Okay.
But very personal decision on multiple sides.
I think that...
And now I love it.
Well, I'm glad. So already in this year, there's been a journey. From the first time it happened to now, you're like, yo, I embrace it. I'm down with it.
Yeah.
I always thought that the hair thing was more so girls than guys. And I think that's a generalization. If somebody has a deep study to prove, no, it's definitely more girls than guys, then fine. But I think culturally, it's a generalization that, you know, women probably preoccupy more. And again, I want to be clear. I think some of that is imposed. It's not necessarily that it's inherent. You know, when you get a sense, remember you talked about survival. So as you kind of sense, okay, wait a minute, it seems like I'm affirmed or loved or some need is met and it's attached to hair. Whether the girl, your hair is so long or it's so straight or it's so whatever the fill in the blank is. I think guys can deal with that too when it comes to hair. I can remember the whole nappy head thing being very, very funny when it came to, you know, young men of color or young boys of color, right? And then doing everything you could to brush and get waves and wear do-rags. And then it was the beard and growing your beard and, you know, the fresh lineup or the person who didn't necessarily seem to value those things. You know, a guy who didn't really get haircuts regularly. You were like, yo, what's going on?
And just looks scruffy.
Yeah. And so you make all kind of identification assessments of them. And so what happened with COVID with me was, for the longest time, I've been wanting to learn to cut my own hair. But I've been very, very afraid because I'm like, I'm going to jack my hair up. And I take pride in, personal appearance, which I think is fine as a baseline. But COVID comes and barbershops are closed. And my barber, get this now, this is his livelihood, but he actually gave me a spare pair of clippers and edgers, knowing that I want to learn to cut my own hair. And so we launched out into the deep. To be honest, Kyla was the first person to cut my hair since all this broke. And since then, I've been cutting my own hair. Go ahead.
I just want to say that really touches my heart. I think that shows an immense level of trust and connection when you can allow your wife to get close to your hair and your hairline.
I feel like you're talking to somebody. I don't know.
I just think men need to understand how important that is for us as women, just to know that you trust us enough and to know that we also value your appearance and identity. Devin finally let me close to his head during this quarantine. And it probably brought us a little closer together. I was admittedly very scared because of how big of a deal he made. He let me get the low line up in the back. He wouldn't let me touch the front. But if he had let me, I was about to be a whole barber. It was about to be a whole situation. But I just had to say that because that spoke to me. It's just like, yes, he let her do it.
Yes, indeed. I let her do it.
What a great connection.
And it did it brought us closer together. I said, babe, we had a moment. We just had a moment. You cut my hair. But since then,
it's a whole moment.
Yeah, it was pretty real. Since then, not because she did a bad job, but because I really want to develop the skill, I've been cutting my hair. And so the point is, you're right. Something as simple as hair that will grow back can be so deeply tied to identity, I think, for men and women. And hair is just the fill in the blank for this conversation. We could fill in the blank with something else. For some people, it's clothes. For other people, it's the kind of cars that they drive. But what I'm learning is, man, nothing outside of the internal work that we've been talking about will adequately satisfy or fill that void. We can't hire out responsibility to all of these other things and themes to bring that sense of peace and wholeness. So here's what I want to ask you as we prepare to close. You can send yourself a text message 10 years into the future. What does it say?
Oh, I have to think about this. The funny thing is, sidebar, I was actually just contacted by a previous supervisor that I had during a summer research experience in Iowa in 2009. And she said she found a letter that I had written to myself and she wanted to send it to me. And she's in the process of sending it. I haven't read it yet, but I'm scared. The immediate thing, I'm sure this letter would be very extensive because I have a lot to say to me and I have a lot of things that I'm hoping for and working for, but it would probably include some of the following. It would probably say something to the effect of I'm so proud of you because my hope is that you finally figured it out, that you're no longer, that you've been able to work through some stuff, and that you're no longer dependent on the opinions of others or the assessment of others to dictate whether or not you're in the place that you should be and whether or not you're successful. I think outwardly people are you're successful and everything else, but I think in every profession there's this imposter syndrome as well, right? And so it would just be I should probably do this now that I'm thinking about it. I might write myself a letter. But it would probably really, really be I'm really excited to see all that you're doing. And I'm sure it's great, and congratulations for rolling with the punches because life is cruel sometimes. Life can be great and it can be cruel. But what makes the difference is that every single day you dedicate and you commit to yourself enough to keep pushing and to continue to try to be a better version of yourself, regardless of what's going on or what's happening or what's not happening. And of course, doing so with God and everything else. But it would probably be a love letter to me.
Awesome. Awesome. That might need to be your next book, A Love Letter to Me.
That would be really, really deep.
Speaking of books, you've recently released a coloring book, Essentially Me Coloring Books. Yes. What is that, and where can we find it?
I'm so stoked. I actually have copies, which is exciting because I previously didn't have copies.
All right.
So exciting. So this was just a little love/passion project. It's available on Amazon. It's also available through me. Lots of people are like DMing me, hey, like I want to buy a copy directly from you so you can sign it. Like, please just get it to me. But it's dedicated to children of color. And I just felt like, considering all things in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of all the social injustice that's going on in the world, like I think that children of color need to know and need to continue to hear the message that like they're essential too, right? They matter. Their lives matter. Regardless of all of the messages that are being portrayed through the media and everything else, like your life still matters and you can be whatever you want to be. And so it was really something that I wanted to do. Like each page, it's actually more than a coloring book. It's like half coping activity book, because it has like different professions represented. So like, I don't even know if you can see like an electrician, or a conductor or something. Sure. And it also has like handwriting practice and stuff. So for the littles, to be able to practice their fine motor skills, letter identification and recognition. It has a little something for everyone. I mean, like I would sit here and color this. I don't even care that it's for kids, but I like coloring because it's very, very therapeutic. But on the back of every page is actually a coping strategy or a coping activity that can be done not only by that kid, but can be done as a family. And there's stuff that's really fun, things that I've used in therapy, some of my favorites. So things like feelings Uno, and it'll tell you like how to set that up and like what that even looks like, or like stress balls and like how stress balls could be helpful and how you make them really, really easily and cheap inside. So I just think it's a great tool and activity. I honestly had no expectations for it. I just wanted to put it out. Sure. So whether it's like successful or not, like I'm already finding success because the fact that I did it, and I feel like I followed the instruction, one of the many that God has just told me to do. Just do it, right? Stop allowing fear to dictate your life. Just put it out. But the other part, kind of like I mentioned before, because I have this really deep passion to like advocate for people who can't advocate for themselves, or to provide tools and get tools into our community that we may not know about. That's why it like functions as more than just a coloring book, because you can just get the coloring book, you can just sit there and color, but then it has so many great tools and strategies that can be used that can actually help to create this coping. And coping is important, this idea of self-care, which we know that can combat trauma.
I love it. I am definitely in need of copies.
This is supposed to be my sister-in-law.
Oh,
that's supposed to be her. Doesn't kind of look like her, but she's a nurse now, and she's won her battle with cancer.
Awesome.
So, Nurse Shanae, but I call her Shanae.
Well, I hope you have enough copies handy, because I want to get one for each of the children in our church. And that will be very meaningful to us. And I thank you for not just the passion project, but again, an investment in the whole health of our children, and effectively in the successive generations by investing in them.
Yeah.
Dr. Sam, where can the people follow you if you are so inclined to let us peek in on your journey on social media, your blog? Share that with us.
Sure. So I believe my Instagram handle is Dr. like spelled out. So DOCTER Sam _I am. Kind of clever. Sam I am. That will be Instagram.
All right.
And really like that Instagram links to everything else. So if you go into like the profile, like it brings up my Facebook, it'll bring up a link to these Essentially Me coloring books. It's a great place to sort of follow and stay tuned, because I do have like other books in the works, other ideas, like board books and stuff that may be coming soon.
Okay.
Hint, hint.
Awesome.
But yeah,
awesome.
Everything is really Instagram, and just be forewarned. I am one of those people. I'm super candid. I love bringing people along in the journey. So like, this is a journey of like who I am in a holistic way, meaning like family, actual like doctor and everything else. So this is not just going to be one of those super staunchy, I'm at work today, I'm just going to type on my computer. Like, no, I mean, I'm kind of silly too, so.
Sure. Go follow Dr. Sam I am, DOCTORSAM_IAM, Dr. Sam I am. And I think people have really seen that and experienced that in this episode. And I have no doubt that more people will want to connect with you and learn from you and grow with you as you are on your journey. It's good to know that clinical psychologists, doctors of clinical psychology, also have mountains to get over and valleys to climb through.
We're all human.
That's right.
We're all trying to make it through this thing called life. We're all struggling with quarantine and all the change in routines and everything that comes with it. So I personally believe that being able to personally experience a lot of the difficulties helps me to be able to connect better as a clinician, because it's not only like a sympathy, but it's like a deep-rooted empathy where I truly get where you are.
Sure.
So we struggle too.
Awesome. Well, that is the purpose of these conversations in the living room. And I want to thank you, the listeners and the viewers, for your support and for hanging out with us in the living room. Thank you again to Dr. Samantha O'Bannon for her time, for being candid, transparent, for allowing us into her space, her living room for these past few moments. I believe that all that we have listened to and learned, we definitely want to take into life. Listen, if you have been blessed and inspired and transformed by our time in the living room, we want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel so that each week you can receive a fresh episode from people. You never know where they're going to come from and what they're coming with, but we do know this: it is something that you will benefit from. That's all we have for this episode of The Living Room, where together we listen and learn that we might live. I'm your host, Richard Martin. Our special guest today has been Dr. Samantha O'Bannon. We'll see you next time.